is Giles Whittell from The Observer. Welcome to the news meeting.
Now, in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Without them, we risk becoming an island of strangers.
Opening statements began today, and the first witnesses were called in the trial of Sean Diddy Combs.
Hamas has released the last remaining US-Israeli joint national held hostage since the October the 7th attacks.
Another day, another presidential pause. The world's two biggest superpowers pulling back from all-out economic war, at least for now.
To help me decide what should lead the news, I'm joined on stage by my esteemed colleagues from the paper. Next to me is The Observer's Whitehall editor, Neilan.
Hello.
Our data editor, Katie, just the facts please, Riley.
We're not in order.
And joining us hello, Katie.
Hi.
Hi. And joining us tonight for the first time ever is news editor Rebecca Myers. Hello. Okay. Let's jump straight in. First, your long stories short in one line or phrase. Tell us what you're going to talk about. Katie, we'll start with you.
For once, I actually have one ahead of time.
Mine is cash cows and scapegoats.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca.
Mine is national emergency.
Kat?
Mine is the real deal.
Okay.
Or the real deal, depending on how you're feeling.
And we're going to find out what it is. Right. Let us start with Katie. You tell us more about cash cows and scapegoats.
Okay. So I know that on the news meeting on Monday, they talked about Labour's new plan for immigration to reduce net migration, and they sort of focused. I was not on the episode, but I listened because I'm a supportive colleague. And they talked about, they focused on the care sector. And I want to talk about a different part of the immigration plan. So the biggest, let's all get up to date actually. So when Labour announced their plan for reducing net migration, which is their immigration plan because their plan is to reduce net migration, at the beginning of the week, they introduced a couple of things that we should all know about. So the biggest reduction in the number that they want to bring down is in skilled workers. So they'd like to reduce the number of skilled workers and skilled worker visas by 39,000 every year. But the second biggest reduction in visas is going to potentially come from students. So 7,000 students less because of the higher education levy, which they're going to impose on universities. 12,000 less on increasing some of the requirements for students, and then another 12,000 less by reducing the amount of time that you get on a graduate visa. So right now, after you graduate from either a master's or an undergraduate program, you get a 2-year visa that you can live in the UK on and get a job on before you have to apply for an employment visa. And they want to reduce that to 18 months.
Katie, can I just jump in and ask a quick question? That 7,000 figure related to students, is there also a bigger number related to students' dependents?
I think that's dependents and students.
Together.
Although, you can't bring dependents as an undergraduate student.
Okay. So that refers to undergraduates, not graduates.
No, it's graduates. Okay. But those are 3 different student categories. Okay. But altogether, that's 31,000. So this is actually the second biggest amount of visas that they'd like to get rid of. And another thing to note is that they increased the sort of time that you have to live in the UK from 5 years on a settlement visa from 5 years to 10 years. I know this all sounds really technical, but we're going to get into why it matters in a second. 5 years to 10 years. So my long story short is cash cows and scapegoats, because we're going to talk about students specifically here now. So for the last about 10 years, when universities were facing funding crises is not a word, funding crises, one of the ways that they raised funds was to increase the A, number of international students, and B, fees for international students, which has been a main source of income for UK universities for the last 10 years or so. For some universities, it's up to like 50% of their income is from international fees. There's no cap on international fees. So while the student fees for home students have stayed quite relatively flat, because those are, voters, international student fees have sort of exploded in the last 10 years. And, hello? Welcome.
They'll catch up.
So the thing that happens when you read this report actually is that you get the sense that there's not actually really any plan for fixing immigration. What they want to do is kind of find a scapegoat for the large number of immigrants that are coming into the country, which they think is too many. And students are an easy one, right? Because they don't vote if they're international students. They're quite vulnerable because they are very, they're not stable in the UK. And it's easy to scapegoat them. While at the same time, they've been propping up the university system for the last 10 years. And by all accounts, if international students decline precipitously, as Labour says they want, it will sort of wreak havoc on the university system, which is a big source of employment and a big boost for the economy in lots of the country.
So you're saying that the plan for immigration isn't really a plan, it's a political document. Can I just put it to you that it is a plan that will bring down immigration? We know that because we're about to get new numbers that will show that it already has as a result of limits on student visas imposed by Rishi Sunak. And they're going to do that again.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they're going to do that no matter the cost to the higher education sector. So they've to leaders to choose, and what we're witnessing is a choice, right?
Yeah, I mean, so all estimates. The interesting thing about this document, which I have as prop because the producers told me they like props, is that there's a lot in here about how many people are coming into the country and how to reduce the number of people who are coming into the UK, but there's nothing about the cost of reducing the number of people who are coming into the UK. So it feels like a sort of, it's a very political document, obviously. The one thing that they really don't mention in this document is that there is a problem with international students, which is that universities, because the fees have been propping up the universities economically, they now do a lot of outsourcing to try to get international students to come to their universities. And there's this sort of cottage industry of recruitment agents which operate in the countries like India and Singapore and China, where a large majority of the international students are now coming from, which exploit students, give them a different picture of what the immigration system in the UK is like, rinse them for cash.
And the white paper does nothing about them?
The white paper does nothing about that. The only thing that they mention is that they're going to require universities to sign up to the Agent Quality Framework, which someone in the industry told the FT is a facade of credibility with no active checks or balances. So they've done nothing to actually address the sources of sort of somewhat problematic student immigration, and all they've done is scapegoat.
So just to be clear, and I know, Kat, you want to say something about this, but what you're pitching is a critique/analysis of the report, and this aspect of it in particular, how it deals with students.
Yes.
That's not a criticism of your pitch. It was an extremely good, long story short.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Kat?
Yeah, I think she's right to focus on the student side of things, because I think it is a big problem. We actually ran a story in the paper a couple of weeks ago before this came out, which was sort of reliant on briefing from various people throughout Whitehall that was kind of trying to explore exactly this issue, which is that not only is going to undermine what has been probably one of the biggest sort of export industries that the UK currently has, and one of our sort of big branding opportunities. We talk about soft power. You know, some of the countries that Katie mentioned there when she was talking about the agencies, well, the agencies might be not very reputable, but those countries, you know, send an awful lot of people here, study here, they go back to their countries and they think about Britain in a different way to the way that they did before. So it's an enormous soft power as well as the actual sort of money that comes in. But the piece of the article that we ran a couple of weeks ago looked at...
Was it by Kat Neilan?
It was by Kat Neilan, yeah, she's very good. Looked at some research that had been carried out by a polling agency called Public First that found that actually several of these universities, which are sort of already on the brink because of the changes to the rules around dependence, are in constituencies that are sort of marginal Labour, likely to fall to Reform. And the argument is that actually in doing this, rather than turning people from Reform to Labour, which I think you probably see by the reaction to the tone that Starmer struck with the immigration speech that he gave on Monday, it hasn't really worked. Far from turning Reform voters or would-be Reform voters to Labour, actually what you do is further fuel the fire, because you end up with economies, local economies that are struggling, people losing their jobs, more disaffected, worse for levelling up, which I know is not a phrase that we use anymore, but you know, the ethos is still there. And actually it ends up being really, really self-defeating. And I know that there has been a lot of tension between Department for Education and the Home Office on this. I was told by one source that, there's no difference, you know, we've been working very closely, absolutely not even a hair's breadth between us. I was then told by someone else that is, quote, bollocks. And there is real kind of upset within certain individuals within DfE that, you know, to their mind, it's just over, and they're worried now for the sector and the jobs that are going to be lost. And, you know, at a time when we're seeing America kind of turfing out a lot of great academics, we should be trying to welcome more of them here.
Just a second. Yes, you have every right to come back, but I want to come to Rebecca first because she's news editor, right? It's Tuesday. This white paper was published yesterday. Starmer spoke about it yesterday. The noise about it has been about how similar to Enoch Powell some of the language was. A day on, let's park for a moment the fact that we work for a Sunday paper, and remember that we also work for a 7-day website. A day on, what aspect of this would you want to focus on? Would it be students, or would it be something else?
It would be part of what Katie has just pitched, and then making it into a bigger piece. I think what she's nailed, which is so important now in these next few days, is what is the cost of this white paper? What does that really look like? Like Kat says, what does that mean for local communities, local towns? What does it mean for towns and cities where there is a university that does hugely rely on foreign fees, which may have to, you know, close its doors, change its courses? What does that mean for local jobs? And I think the piece I would love to kind of read in the coming days is, what is the cost of, if we implement this as is, you know, projected, as is pitched by the government, what does that look like? Where do we end up? Because where we don't end up, I would suggest probably, is tackling the kind of immigration that people are most worried about anyway, which is what we keep coming back to in this country. So that is the, I think, really, really good thing to land on that Katie has spotted, which is, what does this actually look like when you implement it?
Katie?
I think that's the story as well. And the reason I talked about students, so thank you for that. You said that better than I would have. This is also nice.
I know.
We should.
Don't worry.
It may not last. Carry on.
The reason why I kind of zoned in on the student route is not really for personal reasons, because I've had basically every single type of visa. Just throwing out there, I've had it, but is that it shows how unserious this government currently is about actually fixing problems in the country. I think they're not trying to fix the problem with funding for universities. They're also not trying to fix, they say on one hand in this fucking thing, that, you can cut that, that the that they want to encourage high value, and I'm using this in quotation marks because I think these are kind of insidious terms, but highly skilled, high value workers. But what they don't do is make that easier for anybody. What they don't do is make that easier for students to stay after their visas. They're actually after their student visas, they're actually cutting the amount of time you have from 2 years to 18 months. And they are not acting like a government that is worried about productivity or worried about soft power, exactly at the same time that the Trump administration is sort of taking a machete and just like ripping apart one of the most powerful systems of soft power that we've seen in the world, which is the American academic system and the American university system. We should be capitalizing on those things, and we're not, because we're trying to cut down on the number of students coming into the country for some reason, which...
Well, it's because they think that they can say, oh, look, we've reduced the numbers of migrants coming here. Small brackets, they were students. They're not the ones that are coming over on the boats, that's really worried about.
Which is A, a small number, which they admit in this, and B, it's lazy. Well, it's easy and it's lazy, and it shows that they're not actually...
But it's also not what people talk about, and people aren't going to go, oh, thank God those students aren't in my town anymore. They were really bothering me.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, it's not going to work.
No, exactly, it's not going to work, and it's lazy, and it kind of...
But it is what every government has tried to do. I mean, the language is quite similar to what Boris Johnson did with Priti Patel when they were talking about exactly the same.
It's worse.
We want to attract...
It's worse. It's way worse.
We want wages to go up for care workers. We don't want, migrant workers. It's exactly the same kind of thing.
We need to move on in a second, but I do want to ask Kat or anyone else pile in. Is there going to be a backlash, and if so, from where, against the tone of Starmer's remarks yesterday in the foreword to the white paper, which is so nakedly trying to park his tanks on reform's lawn?
Yeah, I mean, even Nigel Farage has said that it went too far. He was quoted on Newsnight on Monday night as having called it divisive, saying that it was going to backfire for him. The only person that I think has gone further or sort of endorsed it is Robert Jenrick, which I think kind of tells you where the Tories are right now. Yvette Cooper was asked about it this morning. I think the general consensus of people that I've spoken to since the speech is that they didn't realise that it was very, very similar to language used by Enoch Powell.
Right.
Someone described it as a fuck-up to me. Unfortunately, that fuck-up was made quite loudly. I think quite a few people noticed. So now it's the sort of thing, it's like Citizens of Nowhere, it's hostile environment, it's that kind of thing that people are going to remember forever.
And finally, Katie, I know this has affected you personally. You can give the very brief version, or you can say, I'm not going to talk about it, but if you were asked to give the first-person version of this story, what would it be?
I mean, unclear, actually, whether it really affects me personally. But, I mean, I'm the kind of... This is the wankiest thing I've ever said. But I have...
Our English.
I'm obviously not British. I'm from the States, and I've been in the country since 2013. I back and forth because I make terrible personal choices. But so I have an undergraduate degree from a university in this country. I have a postgraduate degree from a university in this country. I've worked for 3 or 4 different companies in this country. I was at one time married to a citizen of this country, actually still am, and not for long. But and when you ask about backlash to this, I feel personally quite, like, I don't want to say distraught, but I just feel very like unwanted. I think unwanted.
They've not given you indefinite leave to remain.
No, according to the government, this is the stuff that people don't understand about the immigration system, is that it's already incredibly harsh. That's why there's always so much sort of noise from the immigration sector, is because people get denied visas all the time who should be getting them and who deserve them and who have real asylum claims and who are married to British citizens, and their visas get denied. I know one, actually, because they didn't do the paperwork correctly, because it's an incredibly sort of Byzantine process. And the backlash is going to come maybe the most valuable backlash and most important backlash, I think, is going to come from people like me, who are supposedly the kinds of sort of like, in quotes again, highly skilled workers who the government says they want to attract. I've done everything that the government has ever wanted me to do, right? And, paid a bunch of money for university degrees, paid a bunch of money to the NHS, which regular taxpayers don't have to do, but you have to pay £776 every year to use the NHS as an immigrant. And this is what Keir Starmer has sort of decided of what I've done for his country, and I think it's bullshit.
Okay.
And it makes me not want to become a citizen. It really does. Like, if they want to make it 10 years, fuck that. Like,
maybe that's what they're hoping, Katie.
yeah, well,
thank you very much.
About getting Katie Riley out of the country.
You know what? They're doing a good job, except that actually they're not.
We've let this segment run a little longer than usual because there are many components to it. I'm often reminded of a story, don't know if it's true or not, that John Lennon applied for a sort of gifted and talented person's visa to the US and was turned down.
Well, he's not Paul.
With that, we'll pause for a brief break and then come back and hear what Rebecca thinks should lead the news.
Into ad break about that cocktail class, which is kicking off.
Is it?
Where are our cocktails?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, welcome back. Rebecca, tell us more about the national emergency.
Okay, so I will start this just by saying there is a description of sexual violence, and it's quite an upsetting story, so just to put that out there. I borrowed the phrase, let's try that again. I borrowed the phrase national emergency from the National Police the National Police Chiefs Council, who used this as a way to describe violence against women in the UK last year. And the reason I've used it is because there is a story today, which is from BBC File on 4 Investigates, about a woman who they're calling Kate, who found out that her husband had been drugging her and raping her for a number of years while she was unconscious. The whole case and the way it went through the police, the courts, the system, the CPS, and what it tells us, I think, about how we deal with violence against women in this country is the reason why I wanted to pitch it today. I think it says so much about the sheer challenge women are up against when they report crimes, but also the government are up against, because one of their manifesto pledges was to halve violence against women and girls, which I would love to understand how they're measuring that. We still don't know. But I think, her case tells us so much. So just to sort of bring you through it, her husband confessed to her. That's how she found out this was happening. She initially didn't, it was reported to the police by her mother. She didn't initially want to progress with the case. Very common for victims of domestic violence to not want to initially do that. When she then did decide to go through with the case and speak to the police, she had a very good detective, which is a nice kind of glimmer of hope in this story, who really helped her to understand what happened to her, why it was a crime, that she had been raped, what she'd been put through. But then by the time the case came to the CPS, she had, so the kind of evidence she had, obviously he confessed to her, but she also had, he had medical records in which he told a psychiatrist that he'd done this, so that was in black and white in those records.
How were those notes admissible? Were they not confidentiality?
There is, I think there's a clause basically by which you have to disclose if someone else is at risk in that, to that extent. But he had also confessed to people at Narcotics Anonymous and confessed to friends at church. There was quite a lot of evidence in the case. Police presented it to the CPS, and the CPS decided not to press charges initially. She only got it because she applied for a formal review. They have now apologised to her, and they say we normally make the right decision. In this case, we didn't. And then it took 5 years to go to court. So I think every single step of that has something in it which is telling us what is wrong with the system in the UK, with the way that we deal with violence against women. And also the element of spiking, I think, is really important, really interesting here. There's been a lot of interest in it. The woman herself has said she sees parallels to the Giselle Pellico case. But also there's been a lot of discussion in the UK about spiking all the way through from sort of this kind of a case, which is more unusual, I think, through to kind of spiking in bars and what that looks like. And there is going to be a specific offence coming through in legislation later this year, which is being touted as quite an important solution to this problem, but I would say it's probably not this kind of magic trick we think it's going to be.
You say every single step in this case basically shows how the system isn't working, let her down. But am I right in saying that this particular case, actually like the Pellico case, is both horrible and probably unusual? You're shaking your head, so I'll explain what I mean. There's a Venn diagram, isn't there, of domestic violence, big circle, of spiking, big circle of unknown dimensions. This comes between the two, right?
But the point is that the way that these crimes are recorded is that you don't know. So if a crime is recorded as domestic violence, you don't know whether spiking has been part of that.
Okay.
And if a crime is recorded as a sexual assault, it may not necessarily record that it was spiking as well. It will only record part of it. And that is the problem when Rebecca is talking about
So I want to ask Rebecca if in the details in this story that we know of from File on 4, whether there's any evidence as to how widespread this particular sort of offence is?
Yeah, so we don't know. There's experts quoted in the File on 4 piece who are sort of saying they think this is a lot more widespread than any of us would think it is. As Kat points out, part of the problem is we just don't know. And that's also, you know, the government have been saying part of the reason for making spiking an offence in itself, at the moment it's prosecuted under, I think, like 7 different laws. If we make it an offence in itself, then you will have better data going forward on people who have spiking as part of their case. So his conviction would be for, you know, rape, but also spiking. So partly the problem is we just don't know. But also there are huge questions around like testing for spiking. But I think it's a really misunderstood, little understood area of domestic abuse in particular. And there are increasingly people coming forward warning of, you know, if there are prescription drugs in a house and there's a domestic abuse case that comes from that house, how do we know what involvement those drugs have had in that case? So I think it's an area that our understanding is growing in, but we have so much more to learn. And as this case shows, I mean, even if you just look at this case without the spiking, there are so many things which went wrong for her as a victim or which, you know, need to be dealt with. Like I said, it's great actually to read a story where the police officer did it. She praised him. She said he was brilliant. He really helped me to understand and clearly guided her through the crime itself. But
it's taken years and years, hasn't it?
And it makes you wonder about the cases where there wasn't a police officer like that.
And also where there wasn't that evidence. She says, you know, if my evidence isn't enough.
And the Pellico thing only happened because he got booked for a different offence. And I think the fact that Giselle Pellico's husband was able to find that many men over those years to do this horrible thing to her suggests that they were all, I mean, there are forums online for people who want to do this to their spouses and other people's spouses. Like, it must be more widespread than we have data for.
So how do we find out? I mean, is this a brace story for many similar ones?
I mean, getting into domestic abuse is so difficult, isn't it? That's why it's one of those things that still, I think, has the power to shock, but, you know, what do you do about it? Because what do you do about what goes on behind closed doors? You know, you have to, but that's why I think it's just not sort of appropriate to have a sort of, oh, this is a one-off. It's sort of the blissful ignorance of the nice guy. It's like my husband's response to the Harvey Weinstein thing. It's like, no one can be that bad. Well, yes, actually, people can be that bad and frequently are. And actually, I think, you know, to say, oh, it's just a, you know, one bad apple, it kind of means that you don't then go looking for the other problems and the other instances of this kind of crime. And yeah.
So you mentioned the concept of homes with prescription drugs in. I mean, is there, in practical terms, a journalistic job that could be done where you cross-ref reports of domestic violence, whether followed up or not by police, with prescriptions? Do you think that, I mean, it's a question for a data editor as well, perhaps, I don't know.
I mean, prescription data is anonymous, so NHS prescribing data is anonymous. I mean, I think there is something to be done in, like, well, it's difficult because you don't want to make it a how-to manual.
Yeah, I mean,
like in how to drug your wife, but you know, like you might have these chemicals in your home. You might even have them in your home and not know that you know, could be spiked. by someone in your home if they know what to do with the substances that every sort of normal household has.
I mean, data is a really, really interesting question in this whole story, because also even stripping it back, even just what we know about the picture of domestic abuse, the picture of rape, you know, the tiny percentages that are reported, let alone then prosecuted, let alone then convicted, like all the percentages we're talking about are so small. This may be a case of, you know, awareness, and we may see more people coming forward, but I also think, you know, like I said, there are good lessons from this, and part of that is making sure that police forces know what they're looking for, making sure the CPS know how to prosecute. Obviously, the 5 years to go to court is also, you know, there is a question about wait times and what that experience is like for a victim to wait that long to go to court for something like this. But there's a really interesting data question. Yeah. And spiking as an offence should help inform part of the picture, but I don't think it's a kind of silver bullet.
Okay, thanks very much. Kat, tell us more about The Real Deal.
It's a bit of a vibe shift, guys. The Real Deal is, we've had the India trade deal, we've had the US Nothing Burger trade deal, and this weekend or beginning of next week, we are looking at perhaps having a deal with the EU, which could unlock some jolly good things for the country. So the way that I've kind of been imagining it is sort of like a traffic light system. So I think the green light, the one part of this deal that is most likely to come through is a sort of agreement on defence and security, which should see a sort of the UK paying into a sort of joint procurement fund from which manufacturers across the EU can pitch. That would mean a sort of de facto single market on defence, which is language that people in Whitehall are not terribly keen on, but acknowledge that it's probably fair. Then in the kind of amber level, we've got things like the Youth Mobility Scheme, which is very much an ask from the EU. And on our side, something on SPS, which is sort of shorthand for food standards, food standards, health standards, and sort of medicines and so on. That is our big ask, and that is one of the things that the government really is trying to push, because it will reduce the costs of foods and so on, cost of living still being very kind of high in people's minds.
By reducing the number of checks at the border and making it easier to
by just making it easier for things to travel across borders. So, you know, you get, I mean, you know, you don't have lorries stuck in traffic with fish going off and what have you. And then sort of slightly cheating a bit, but there's the kind of, I think fisheries is sort of halfway between amber and red, but it sounds as though it's probably going to be a continuation of the current status quo, which the EU isn't happy with. And then red, things that I don't think are going to happen are, but I might be wrong, who knows, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, so if you're a lawyer or, you know, professional services, and also financial services, which from my background when I was covering Brexit the first time round, that was quite high up on the list of priorities, so it's interesting that it's dropped back down. But apparently the thing we want to get over the line is SPS, because that's the thing that we're being told is the most problematic. That is the thing that I think will probably have the most resonance with voters when they see. And
the thing that the European side wants to get over the line is youth mobility, and you're saying that there's movement. Yeah, so it's kind of been one of those things that they've been saying there's red line for ages, because Labour is very, very worried about perceived so-called backsliding on Brexit. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, who this week has been, although perhaps not the voice that people will remember, but she is certainly the kind of person behind the immigration white paper that we've just been talking about, has been quite sort of resistant to anything on this. As I understand it, Nick Thomas-Symonds, who is the Minister for European Relations, was particularly instrumental in getting her to sort of concede a bit of ground. There are some carve-outs which will make it more palatable. So, for example,
they're kind of talking about it in terms of very much being a replication of an existing deal, so akin to the type of deal that we have with Australia. It's going to be controlled, is kind of a big word that is always being associated with this. So cap on number, time limits, restricted access to benefits. One of the EU asks is that they get domestic level university fees. Doesn't sound like that's going to happen.
There's 27 countries whose, let's say, 20 to 30-year-olds, whatever the age range is, would be allowed to come and spend time here. And one country being allowed to send people out to 27 countries. Do we know how they're going to control the numbers?
I don't know that level of detail, but I think the only way that it would fly is if there is... I don't know about a cap on numbers, because obviously, even when it comes to immigration, they're quite reluctant to put a physical number on it, because what happens if you get one more than that? But probably more likely would be it's time limited.
Right.
I think the current ones for Australians and Canadians and etc. All the countries we pretend we like a little bit more than the other ones.
It's 2 years,
It's
right?
like 2 years, yeah.
But there's a performative, as you know, this stuff makes my blood boil, and I just try to keep myself under control. But Yvette Cooper, as you've said, has been a source of resistance to all this. But it's all performative, isn't it? Here is a lifelong Remainer.
Planning an opposition
It's
day.
like she's taking one for the team, right? Okay, I'm going to be the villain who opposes youth mobility and restricts all our kids.
Look, I know we're going to have an argument about this.
No, I think we're on the same side.
So Yvette Cooper may have been a Remainer, but her seat was not.
Right.
The same with Nick Thomas-Symonds.
So she's just being a good constituency MP and a very, very bad leader.
That's your opinion.
Yeah.
Their opinion is all of these people who voted, some of them for the first time in their lives in 2016, voted thinking, my voice doesn't count, no one ever listens to me. And whether or not you think they were right, they voted that time. And they're talking about voting again for the second time for Nigel Farage. And so, yeah, there is a bit of political reality concern and also just a sort of genuine recognition that actually some of the people that voted for Brexit did so because they feel that they have been left behind, that they have been ignored by successive governments, and they wanted to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that opposing specific details of a European youth mobility scheme, though, is going to get them to vote for Nigel Farage?
No, I don't. But I think that there is concern, and it might be misplaced.
Prevent them voting for Nigel.
No, I know, but exactly. But
it
that's
might be misplaced, but there's
also, they're not running for election
that
for
might
5
play
years.
it. That might play it as such. Certainly, the Tories are talking about doing an opposition day debate about exactly this, making the kind of political point. And you guys might not like it, but you're not the country at large.
Can I also, because one thing we haven't really actually talked about in terms of who Labour are trying to please voting-wise, who they're worried about. They're worried about losing people to Reform, but they're going to have to really start worrying about losing people to the left. Yeah.
And the Greens.
Oh yeah, no, I think.
And they have a very thinly spread majority, and it's so interesting because obviously Reform is the kind of the big scary thing right now. But if this is the kind of stuff that is, that they're coming out with, they are going to have a problem with other voters that aren't really being discussed necessarily.
But if they get this over the line, does that not do something to sort of show those kinds of people that they are listening to them as well? I mean, I totally agree with you. I think they're spending way too much time obsessing about Reform and not enough worrying about the Lib Dems and Greens. But I don't.
Or the country. Actually governing the country and making the country better. And
I am not in the Labour government. I'm just.
I know, but okay, I know, but this is the same story as my story, isn't it? It's like this. They've come into power and they have 5 years to improve the country and make changes, and they're scared of the next election 5 years before it happens.
I have been quite sceptical about how seriously to take them on the EU side of things, because I do think that they are sort of scared of their own shadows on this, but I think they have made more movement than I was expecting, and what they are hoping to do is position it as a win. So on defence, they're hoping to position it as British jobs, because there's obviously a lot of British-based weapons manufacturers that will be bidding for EU-wide contracts, which they can't currently do at the minute, and that will mean jobs and so on. They're hoping to, have something for the youth to say, look, we've kind of managed to get you guys some access back again, and they're hoping to have something for the sort of bog standard family that is worrying about bills, as many people are, by being able to say, actually, do you know what, we've got this food standards agreement, that means that your whatever fish or cheese, whatever comes from Europe, fruit will be cheaper now. So I can see where your scepticism is coming from, and I'm definitely not saying that's wrong, and I'm also not saying that they're, I'm also not saying that they're spending what am I saying? Yes, I think they are spending too much time worrying about reform and not enough about the parties that are likely to kind of come up from the left or even from the middle. But this is not that. Let's
come back finally to the news bit of it. Forgive me for raising my voice just now. It's habit. I apologise.
With me specifically?
No, with Europe. But actually, there's some news here, which is movement on youth mobility. Yeah. Right? That's what you're reporting. That's what you're bringing to the table.
I mean, yeah. But I was told we will only do youth mobility if we get SPS in return. And so I know you're obsessed with youth mobility, Giles, but I do think that potentially cheaper food because of a deal on standards is quite a big deal.
Oh, I agree.
But I have put it in the amber category because I think what's going to happen is there will be an agreement in principle that we do want a youth mobility scheme and we do want an SPS deal, but we now agree that we have to go off and have further talks to get there.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we get to the fun part where you three get to choose what you want to lead the news. There's only one rule, you can't choose your own stories. So, Katie, which is it to be? Do you want a moment to think?
Yes. We'll
come to the other end of Kat, do you know which one you're going to choose?
Yes, I'm going to go for the student's story. Apologies, Rebecca. I am going to go for the student's story because I think it's really important, and unlike my story, I think it is something that we could take a kind of campaigning position about if we wanted to, and actually really kind of hammer them on it and speak to academics, speak to students, speak to people that have studied here and then gone back to their countries, as I said, to kind of make the point that, and speak to maybe some reform voters in some of the constituencies that we're talking about, and kind of make the point that it is shooting yourself in the foot.
Okay, Rebecca?
I'm also going to go with Katie's stories now, don't feel bad. Yeah, I think I think students is a really interesting part of it. I think the future of what it means for the higher education system is really serious. But I also think what the decisions that are made now and what they will do to this country over the next few years and what it will look like are huge and really, really serious. And I think it speaks to so many bigger issues that we are going to be grappling with in the months and years to come.
Okay. Katie?
So as much as it is my instinct to not choose Kat's story all the time, regardless of the story, and it's not just because I'm obviously mad at the Labour government and I feel personally insulted by my neighbour, Keir Starmer, is that I think this is a good story that we don't cover well as just a general media apparatus. And yeah, I think there's a challenge in 100,000 years on covering Brexit. And this is one of those places where we should be talking about why we're here and sort of the effect that it's going to have on people now and why we still need to care about it. So yeah, I'm choosing Kat.
And Kat's story, we're going to summarise as youth mobility, though of course it's bigger than that. Okay, we're going to take a second short break and then I will say what actually leads the news.
Is that VPN add-on? I don't know.
VPN?
That's actually now that's going out. It's going out. Sorry. It might be in the episode.
Don't
ask questions. We're just going to keep going.
Okay. All right, welcome back. Now I get to decide what I think should lead the news. Katie had the best long story short, cash cows and scapegoats. It summarises very pithily two massive issues and injustices in a way, but it's not going to lead the news because I felt that it was
Poorly pitched. Just say it, Giles.
I think your version of this story is your version of this story, which is the first person story. But I had to coax that out of you at the end.
Well, journalists
no. This is not the time for debate. It's not a democracy. And the EU story, you did good bringing some news to the table, but I think we're going to keep our powder dry and wait until Monday the 19th, which is when the summit happens. Who the heck is Ben Hardy? No, I'm not going to. Apologies, I put it on silent. It is now Tuesday. The summit is on the 19th. That is next Monday. We know from experience that there are a lot of plates in the air. As the European negotiators always say, nothing agreed is agreed until everything is agreed. It is to me, it's a huge story, but we're going to keep our powder dry and see if, in fact, they might. The reveal might be even bigger than youth mobility. There is no question in my mind that the story that leads the news, and full disclosure, this is partly because the BBC told it very, very well in their treatment on File on 4, is the story of Kate and her spiking and her long search for justice. And it is not pure misery. Most of it's a miserable story, but as Rebecca pointed out, there is an element of hope in the fact that she got help for many years. Got help for many years from a good detective who happened to be male. There are obviously not enough of them. So that is my decision. But seeing as we've got an audience here in our newsroom, let's find out what you think, what stories we missed, whether I made the wrong decision. I'm sure many of you will think I have. I should notice, by the way, that, well, there's a reason we didn't talk about the jumbo jet, which Trump has been offered by Qatar, because that was discussed in yesterday's episode.
I think all of us tried to pitch the jumbo jet to the producers before they told us we couldn't.
Right.
So.
Let's raise the house lights and see if anyone wants to tell us what we should have been talking about.
Dun dun dun.
They've banned nudity on the red carpet at Cannes.
Don't feel like you have to fill, Giles. It's okay.
What does
nudity on the carpet?
Do you know where the phrase? Where does the phrase "keep our powder dry" come from?
It's from
sailing.
Our early days in the news business in the 18th century, when we sent
the Navy
fleets around the world with cannons and cannonballs.
Okay, and does anyone else have anything that they would like to add? We do have some retakes, so speak now or just... Okay.
Serena, would you like to...
Katie, that's cruel. Kat Neilan.
Yeah.
You didn't say what SPS was.
Sanitary and phytosanitary products.
That's so lovely. Can you say it in a sentence? And then with the magic of editing in post-production, that's going to be cut in right at the top so no one will be confused when they listen back.
SPS, which is one of our kiosks, SPS stands for sanitary and phytosanitary. It basically means food products and pharmaceuticals and things like that.
Lovely. And Casey, you have one more for Giles.
Yeah, Giles, can you say, let's start with Katie.
Let's start with Katie.
Thank you.
And I have one. Katie, can you just say hello?
This has happened before. Hello.
Ah, lovely. Thank you so much. Giles is just going to wrap up, and then at the end, there's more applause. So if you just take my cue, I'll be out the side.
Katie, Rebecca, Kat, Rebecca, Katie, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you to everyone here in the newsroom. We host a live show every month, and for the summer we're going glamorous. We'll be at the Hay Festival on the 29th of May, and then the South by Southwest Festival in London on the 4th of June. Who knew there was a South by Southwest Festival here?
Is it in
as well as in Texas?
Is it in Clapham?
I don't know. Probably
It's a little
is.
London-based joke for you.
Like I said, fancy that. To book your ticket, go to observer.co.uk/book. And if you can't wait until then, follow us on social media to keep up to date on all our journalism here at The Observer. We'll be back with another episode on Friday, but until then, goodbye.